And good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our Center for Practice Excellence Speaker Series. My name is Zubin Austin, and I am the Academic Director for the Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's session. I will turn it over now to the administrator for our center, Annalise Mathers, to do our land acknowledgement and introduce our speaker and discussant for today. Thank you for joining us and enjoy today's session. Over to you, Annalise.
Thanks, Zubin, and welcome to everyone who's joining us. It's nice to see some familiar names and faces trickling in from online. And we have a really interesting and unique presentation for today. So we'll jump into that in just 1 second. Before we get started, I just wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates, which is where I am located today. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're really grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. So during our event today, I think most of our guests online today are pretty familiar with our format, but we'll just ask that you keep yourself muted and kindly put any questions or comments in the chat, and we'll get to those at the end of today's presentation from Shellyza and also remarks from Jared. So jumping right in, I'd just like to introduce our presenter for today, and I could say so much more, but I'll keep it to a short bio so she can jump into her presentation. Shellyza Sajwani is the current co-chair of the Canadian Association of Pharmacy for the Environment, and also the co-chair of the Ottawa Hospital Pharmacy Environmental Stewardship Committee. She is the co-lead for the International Pharmaceutical Federation, or FIP, Development Goal for Environmental Sustainability. Shellyza also works as a pharmacist within climate change, global health, and oncology-based settings. Shellyza, I'll turn it over for your presentation, and then I'll introduce Jared when he's going to provide some remarks.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. It's lovely to see all of you today, and I can see people who have come here from various areas, some who are within Canada, some who are within other countries working on climate-related issues in pharmacy, and some who are not in climate change at all and are working in other areas that really have a big focus with regards to require a lot of resources with regards to advocacy, and I'm really glad that they're doing the work that they're doing today. I just want to mention to you today that my pronouns are she and her, and I'm coming to you from the land of the Anishinaabe peoples. My parents and my grandparents were both refugees many years ago, and I'm to this day very, very grateful to be here and to have the privilege to be here on the land of the Anishinaabe peoples. And we will talk a lot about how lasting change can also have an equity focus as well. So there was a sentence, a particular word in today's topic, which was focused on advocacy. And when I think of advocacy, I sometimes cringe a little bit because I'm worried about what people will think. You know, when we think of advocacy, typically we think of, activists who kind of have two fists up and are ready to be able to fight for change. And sometimes we think of it in terms of fighting against either people or organizations or structures, but I want to really reframe this and think about the definition of advocacy, which is really just support or recommendations related to a particular cause or a particular policy. It's most effective when we're actually working all together. So when we are identifying the particular values that we are focused on, and we're working with various partners, with whether it be small or large organizations, whether it be individuals or groups, to kind of come together to advocate for a topic. And this topic of advocacy could apply to multiple areas. It can apply to climate change. It can apply to Indigenous perspectives, which are very much intersected for sure with climate change as well. You can have advocacy for the lives of young adult cancer populations as well, and a whole host of other very, very important causes as well. And I want to mention here that partnership is key. So when we think of activism, or when we think of people who are building for change, we often think of those individuals who are kind of standing alone, kind of like a superhero type figure. But I want to try to take away from that. I want to try to remove that impression and that kind of glorification of that individualism, and really think about how can we make change with informal and formal partnerships. So I'm going to go to the next slide here, and many of you have seen variations of that slide, and often the phrase is, you know, I'm going to just focus on what I can control. And that is very fair, because we have so many concerns, so many things in the world that are really hitting us right now, and we're very overwhelmed. We might have exams, and we might have jobs, and we might have families, and not everything is within our control. Not everything is within our control, and maybe we should just kind of focus on the stuff that we know 100% that we can control. But I'd like to challenge that a little bit. I'd like to think about, well, you know, there is actually a little small area in between here, which is not necessarily the area that you can control or not control, but it's somewhere in the middle, which is your area of influence. And we can surprisingly, especially when we come together, have a lot of impact with regards to influence on particular topics that may seem a little bit more kind of general or abstract, but really do filter down to all of our lives. So some of these examples include, let's say, the women's movement of the 70s, the civil rights movement. These were all areas where individuals, normal, ordinary human beings, basically decided that, look, I can't control necessarily certain day-to-day things that are happening, but I can come together with others to be able to influence a particular direction. And sometimes when you focus on that area of influence, you're able to realize that actually we have more influence than we think sometimes. Particularly when topics are really, really challenging. So climate change is one of those topics. But in general, when topics are really, really challenging, like you know, seeing, for example, very, very young children go through very difficult circumstances, or understanding that, you know, climate is such a massive, massive issue that is affecting so many people and will affect so many people, we psychologically have to make a choice. And often that choice doesn't happen at one particular point, but we have to keep reaffirming that choice regularly, while also doing self-care at the same time, where we're thinking, okay, well, we can choose to either, you know, say that, look, nothing can be done, and we have a doomsday approach, and, you know, I'm just going to kind of throw up my hands. And sometimes, you know, there's very good reasons why we're very intimidated by that particular issue. And sometimes instead we are thinking, you know what, this is not something that I can control at all, and I want to focus on other key priorities, and I'm going to go down the line of ignorance instead. And sometimes that can be unintentional, but often it can be willful ignorance too. And I want to bring in that idea of self-compassion here, because all of us, through mental health and through the struggles that we have, sometimes have to think about, you know, look, I can't think about this particular issue right now. I need to focus on what is right in front of me. But what I want to encourage here is a constant reassessment of, is there something that I can influence? And is there an area where I can come together so that I'm not alone in trying to deal with this particular topic? And I can spend a little bit more time where I can in the area of resolution. So these are common barriers. The first is a lack of urgency, or a myth of doomsday approach. So this is ironic, because with climate, sometimes I speak to people who say, oh, you know, like, it's not really urgent right now. It's going to become more urgent in 10, 15 years time. And then I talk to others who say, you know, it's too late. There's nothing we can do. So really trying to channel, like trying to look at those myths and think, okay, well, let's challenge them. Let's think about where we're actually at and what influence we potentially can have. The second is imposter syndrome. And in pharmacy in particular, we're used to thinking that in order for us to actually do some work, we need to be able to have the right qualification and we need to be an expert in a particular area. But what happens when there's no expertise that are actually built in a particular area? What constitutes an expert, and what can people, is imposter syndrome really a potential barrier to change as well? Another one is thoughts regarding time. I don't have so much time right now to do this. I have a mortgage, I have exams, I have other things that I need to focus on. And one thing here to think about is the fact that when you have 20 people that are each doing 1 hour a week, for example, suddenly you have a sustainable way to be able to create lasting change. So time is a very valid reason, but sometimes we can also help build structures such that we can create a mechanism for a lot of people to do a small amount of time, to put in a small amount of time that's effective in order to create sustainable change too. And understanding where to start is very, very understandable as well. But there are more and more opportunities now, which we'll get into, to be able to understand where you can kind of focus on. And I want to mention here, I don't know, there may be some students in this audience. I want to mention for me specifically, I both during my Master's of Pharmacy, which was like in the UK, it's basically a 4-year entry to practice degree, as well as during my PharmD at the University of Toronto. I was never the person who was always the best at memorizing. For me specifically, I gravitated a little bit more to trying to understand kind of the forest and the wider scheme of things. And then I had to be trained in my own practice and also work on continuous professional development on how to be really good at looking at the trees and not just the forest. So I want to mention this in particular here because my own skills of looking at the forest as well as the trees came into use later on as well when I was thinking about organizational development. And the reason why I mentioned this, you may not be someone who really likes thinking about forests, but the reason why I'm mentioning this is because everyone comes with their own personalities, their own perspectives, their own skills, their own expertise. And we also have an opportunity to continue to develop our skills as well. So both valuing the expertise that you have come, like that you have, as well as valuing the opportunities to continue to grow are important. So these are some starting points for those of you who are looking for starting points. Looking at, are there issues that you have been, quite frustrated or about, or you found kind of painful to see a particular gap in something that a patient needs or a population needs or that the world needs, or even what a city needs. It could be the reason for feeling pain, that kind of painful feeling could be a personal motivation. I am the child of refugees. So for me, issues of equity related to immigration are particularly important to me and kind of pointed me into the direction of Pharmacists Without Borders Canada. As I'm also a cancer survivor. So I've historically been very interested in seeing what organizations like Young Adult Cancer Canada and other cancer survivorship organizations do. And when I was going through cancer, I experienced this really massive kind of tornado outbreak that came out in North America in 2018. And it was in Ottawa and also in happening in a few other cities as well at the same time. And I was going through cancer at the same time and going through chemotherapy and worrying about accessing treatment. So we all basically have our own potential motivations for doing various things that come from our own experiences. And we can also learn to be able to empathize with populations that are going through other issues. And this can, both our own empathy as well as our own experiences can potentially help here. Looking at your value systems, there is a really good exercise by, if you look at Brené Brown, she has a leadership exercise that you can do to identify what are your value systems and understand what basically makes you motivated, and what how does your own value system basically color your own experiences and color what you're interested in. So for me, my value systems are really focused in on compassion and connection. And how much time you have. When I started climate-related work, I said, look, I can only give maybe about 3 hours a week right now. And so we realized that there was more and more people who said, look, I can give a small amount of time, maybe 1 hour a week or so, or even 1 or 2 hours a month. But really learning how do you channel that particular time in a particular institution is important, and then use that time to help build sustainable structures, knowing that you aren't going to be working in a particular role forever. So you can also look at particular sectors. So within climate change, specifically within pharmacy, I tend to look at mitigation, so the reduction of emissions, adaptation, how do you pivot or protect, pharmacy systems to be able to protect them against climate hazards like heat waves and disasters. And then also, how do you look at reducing emissions and reducing, pharmaceutical pollution. But you could also look at the sector. You could look at particular ages. You could look at particular racial backgrounds. You could look at a particular sector of work like community pharmacy, hospital pharmacy, or industrial pharmacy. And you could also combine them as well. So understanding what are you interested in, what work could you potentially do for free, understanding your value systems, and understanding what expertise do you bring to the table. And you may say, oh, I'm a student, I don't really know what expertise I bring to the table. But you would be surprised as to how much you know that others may not know. So for example, coming up with communication posts, learning how to use Canva, learning how to use social media, administrative work like data entry, taking minutes. Maybe you come from a more strategic background and you're at the verge of retirement and you're thinking, well, I've been doing management related work for a long time and I'd like to be able to be more of a strategic advisor as well. So there are a lot of different types of opportunities that you can that you can kind of capitalize on based on your own experiences. And I know this has been general, very, very, very general until now, and I'm going to start going a little bit more detailed, but I just wanted to use this to kind of paint the picture first. And one particular thing to think about as well is whether you want to be able to join an existing structure or build a new structure. And by structure, I mean, it could be a national organization, it could be a committee within an existing structure, like we have the Ottawa Hospital Environmental Stewardship Committee. It could be a committee within, or a group within a university setting. So there's a lot of different types of structures that exist. And what you need to think about is, what is the particular gap? What can I do? And what structures can I either build or join in order to get there? So connections typically help here. So when we started the Canadian Association of Pharmacy for the Environment, we basically posted on QID, which is a platform used by the Canadian Society of Hospital Pharmacists, to ask, look, is there anyone who's interested in something like this? Cascades, specifically for climate, has a particular platform where they have monthly gatherings to talk about various initiatives that people are doing, or kind of, if someone is looking to create a particular initiative, they provide that platform to have that discussion as well. RX for Climate is another group of climate-specific pharmacy professionals that exist. And I see a couple of people from RX for Climate here as well. And they offer some networking opportunities as well. And even if it's not a formal platform, there are also WhatsApp groups, there's specific contacts you can be in touch with to ask for advice. You can kind of stalk people on LinkedIn to understand, what are they doing, and ask if you can have a short conversation with them as well. So there's a lot of different touch points. I recently went to Green Drinks, which is an opportunity to be able to talk to other people within the climate space as well. And then maybe you feel like you don't really know enough to know even where to go, and what to ask. And here there's a lot of you can start Googling for climate change in pharmacy. I've provided some particular websites that can help just to provide a framework related to your particular area. But even let's say you're interested in young adults and cancer. There's an individual here from the Young Adult Cancer Canada. If you're interested in Indigenous and pharmacy professionals and looking at that intersection, you can look at their website as well. So we've talked about the forest a lot. Let's now talk a little bit about going into a little bit more detail. So now we've understood, okay, this is the topic we want to do, that we'll focus on. And we've looked at, this is a topic that I'm personally very passionate about. And I've tried to kind of now talk to various people who are interested in this area. And now we've decided that we're going to build an initiative. So the first thing we need to think about is what needs to be achieved? What is the outcome? And framing it this way allows us to come up with a particular goal. Why does this need to be achieved? This will provide the motivating kind of force for all of us, for all of us. Where will allow us to think about, what particular area do we want to focus on, and who are the stakeholders that can be worked with? Are there others who have similar goals? So the University of Toronto has a really great platform to think about pharmacy and environmental sustainability. So that is a great way to think about a great potential partner. But there are also pharmacy associations, there are hospitals as well. And sometimes hospital pharmacy management or community pharmacy management may not have the resources to focus on a particular issue at the moment, but they might be thinking, oh, they might agree with you to say that, look, this is an area that it really requires a lot of focus, and we would like to be able to support you in trying to magnify your particular messaging and help you to, for example, apply to grants and that kind of thing. So is this something that a small nonprofit or a small committee or a small group can actually achieve with partnership? So identifying the gaps, I just want to reiterate, try to identify something, an institution, for example, that you're familiar with. If you're wanting to look at a committee or a group within a particular institution, review general processes within that institution. So if we take the Ottawa Hospital, for example, and we think about how patients are treated, are there people who fall through those gaps, not at the fault of the institution or not at the fault of any particular individual, but just because of systemic gaps? So, and what are those systemic gaps? So a really good example is with young adults, we have a really good support for children who are going through cancer. We have a good support for adults who are going through cancer, but sometimes that younger adult population requires more support with regards to survivorship. Perhaps we are noticing some gaps with regards to immigrant populations, with regards to language translation, and with regards to understanding context for diversity and inclusion. So there are various services or various education, for example, that could be built for those particular populations. And for me specifically, looking at how do you reduce emissions within a healthcare setting, looking at how do you adapt pharmacy settings to climate hazards is also an area that's not just a gap for a particular institution, but is a systemic gap. But you can start from one particular institution. And you can see, what a committee or what a little bit more intimidating, what a small institution, a volunteer-run nonprofit basically address this. So these are some examples. So Pharmacists Without Borders, I currently I'm a little biased with the examples that I'm using because these are examples of groups that I've either interacted with or or worked with. So Pharmacists Without Borders Canada, they help to provide medication management training in other countries, and the gap is trying to address the disparity in medication access. Young Adult Cancer Canada tries to help to support cancer survivors. The Canadian Association of Pharmacy for the Environment tries to improve environmental sustainability and planetary health within the pharmacy profession. And remember, you don't want this to be all about yourself. So the first thing you're going to do is to try to find other people who would be able to do this with you by floating the idea of, are there other people who are interested in this? You also want to think about later whether there's possibilities for this institution or this committee, the work of the committee, or the work of particular groups to have funding, whether through community fundraising or grants or other means. Are there possibilities for institution-to-institution partnerships? So a good example here is, yes, I am one of the 2 co-founders of the Canadian Association of Pharmacy for the Environment, but there's a really strong group of 20 people that exist across the country who are co-leads. There are 6 consultants, there are 6 students, and I'm more thinking about in 5 years' time, or in 2 years' time, or however amount of time there is, I don't really have ambition for myself. I have ambition for how can the institution continue to grow, whether I'm in it or not. So it's very humbling because you are really looking at the longer growth of an institution and looking at how that institution can impact a particular population related to a particular cause. Diversity is your hidden gem. We're not very good at acknowledging or appreciating. We're not good at appreciating diversity. So if we think of diversity of skill set, you can look at who is good at social media communications, who's good at fundraising, who's more big picture, who's more detailed. Do people have topic specific interests? But from an equity specific lens as well, there are often areas that are not thought of. And sometimes those areas are extremely critical to be able to think about and bring in different perspectives. So having that equity focused lens on your organization is really important too. Change management is critical. So your mindset of thinking, are you, if a mistake happens, which they will happen, are we thinking about adaptive ways to be able to improve? Or are we kind of just getting more into a paralyzing kind of shame spiral? Having that kind of mindset on an individual basis, sometimes, especially in leadership positions, can really impact how your institution also develops as well. Does your institution have a quality improvement mindset to continue to grow? And with volunteer and versus paid organizations, with volunteer institutions in particular, you can have a lot of flexibility in thinking about how you want to set up different portfolios too. So from a roadmap perspective, I just want to mention, there's some starting points here, thinking about reflecting first, then thinking about consultation. So with every role that I go into, I appoint a consultant for myself, whether that is like a leadership role or a non-leadership role. I ask somebody to be in touch with me once every 6 weeks or so that I can basically ask them questions. And sometimes often it's not just one consultant or one coach that I have. I will talk to certain people about strategic questions. I'll talk to other people about equity specific questions. And it's important to be able to have that consultancy normalized to be able to really facilitate your growth. Approaching stakeholders, maybe key people that you might be coordinating with, and having an idea of how you want to structure that conversation and what kind of questions you would want to ask, what kind of multilateral wins you could have. A win for that particular organization and a win for yourself could be really, really useful. Setting up visions and a vision and objectives. So we want to achieve this, and we want to achieve this big goal, like reducing emissions, etc., via 1, 2, and 3 objectives. And you can think of those objectives even as SMART objectives. So you can come up with indicators to understand how you're going to quantify how you're going to achieve those particular objectives too. With recruitment and with setting up portfolios, if you're looking to build a new committee or build a new institution, sometimes co-lead structures work because people tend to kind of bounce things off of each other. As long as the roles are there's a good understanding of who is doing what. But really having some kind of structure where people can bounce things off of each other, where people don't feel alone is important, but also understanding there's no one size fits all in terms of how you decide to structure a particular group or committee as well. We'll come up with some examples, but there's really not a one size fits all. You kind of just have to choose a particular approach and then continue to adapt that approach based on the feedback that you're getting. So the roadmap, CAFE is a particular example. I'm just coming to the end of this presentation now. So CAFE started, we basically bounced off ideas off of each other in the spring of 2022. We kind of put out a call out then to ask if anybody would be interested. And then we reviewed strategic areas, we recruited co-leads for every area, and then we basically developed objectives for every portfolio as well. And then we started forming partnerships very, very early on. So there's a lot of work that has happened with collaborations with CSHP on a sustainability task force, collaborations with CPHA, for education. And for those of you who are non-pharmacists or not out of Canada, these are national pharmacy associations and societies that work on various initiatives. So we're basically a small body that does a lot of work with bigger bodies in order to be the most effective. So you can think of various portfolios here. So your internal portfolios can be portfolios that are kind of content specific, that are more focused on what is the meat of that particular organization or that particular business or that particular committee. So for us, we think about climate mitigation, climate adaptation, supply chain management as key kind of meat or content specific areas. With Pharmacists Without Borders, this would be like your missions that you provide, so your missions lead or your individuals who are responsible for developing that. And then you have external facing items that are more kind of portfolios that are more on, how do you manage fundraising? How do you manage communications? And how do you look at education and providing presentations to people? You need to actually create portfolios that will actually do all of these different types of things. So this is just an example of our internal portfolios and our external portfolios, specifically for CAFE with a QR code. But don't try to necessarily just replicate this. Just think about what are the particular needs of your particular group in terms of what needs to be accomplished. So if social media needs to be accomplished, you need people to be able to do that. If education needs to be accomplished, you need someone to actually have time to do that. And then what needs to be developed from an internal content perspective as well. CAFE's big learning is that focus on one phase at a time. Right now, we're continuing to learn, continuing to grow. We're focusing in on strategic planning now and finishing our strategic planning process. We're also looking at options for financial sustainability because right now, all of this is all staffed by volunteers. So for financial sustainability, I'll just quickly mention, you can think about community fundraising, you can think about grants, partnerships, nonprofit registration might help with this, but also understanding who is responsible for doing this with regards to who's responsible for your fundraising, who's responsible for applying to those grants, and setting up capacity who will actually do this. And that capacity doesn't necessarily have to be a pharmacist. You could have a social media person who is coming from a communications background. You could have someone who's really good at fundraising for charitable organizations who could be your fundraising person. We've explored this specifically. I know Pharmacists Without Borders has looked into this, and the Canadian Association of Pharmacy for the Environment is also looking at how do you further engage, for example, pharmacy technicians as well. Climaceutics is a new initiative. I'm being funded for a year to focus on initiatives where you can come up with ways to reduce emissions within community pharmacies. So now I'm being paid to work on this for Climaceutics specifically. And we just started a couple of weeks ago. So we're currently in the process of building possibilities there with regards to offering a package for community pharmacies. And there's a QR code there for Climaceutics too. The last slide, I think I'm a bit over time, I'm not sure, but the last thing I would mention is avoiding common group pitfalls. And I'm going to spend a couple of minutes specifically here. So these are common nonprofit pitfalls that, don't feel embarrassed if you run into these issues, because they're almost organically likely to come up and you have to consciously try to address them. So one is fiscal instability. So, trying to transition between that volunteer to paid structure is sometimes also, it has multiple steps. So if you have a finance member, for example, on a nonprofit, you have to make sure that you're looking at, okay, providing that member with roles and responsibilities, direction, understanding what kind of direction that they have, what kind of ideas that they have, and really making sure that you nail the finance pieces, particularly if you're starting to now transition from a group that is a volunteer-run group completely to a group that now funds particular either particular activities or a particular administrative activity, administrative work within your organization. This also applies to committees too. So if you have funds that are dedicated towards the running of a particular project or the running of a particular committee, you need to always check in to see, how is that going? How is your budgeting going? Like, is it cost effective? The second one is ambiguity versus being too specific. Sometimes when roles are too ambiguous and you don't have a good list of roles and responsibilities in what we call a terms of reference. So like that's basically a list of roles and responsibilities for a particular role. Then sometimes people, if they don't know what they need to do, they will not be as interested as well, because they'll be completely confused as to what they need to do. And keep in mind that, you may not have the strength of like your strength may not be that I'm really, really good at building terms of references. So if you're not good at doing it, how can you either learn how to do it or work with others who know how to do this as well? Being too specific and too regimented is also sometimes a challenge, because then that doesn't allow for that kind of elastic feeling of growth as well. So you kind of have to hit the sweet spot and keep reassessing. Micromanagement is an issue. So I've always joked that, sometimes I don't know whether I'm providing too little support or micromanaging. And the best way to know is having very honest conversations with your colleagues. Ask them, am I being too much in your face, or am I not providing enough support? And this is sometimes a little subjective too. So it's good to understand what that particular person needs in order to best hit that sweet spot. Lack of diversity is a problem, and that can exacerbate unconscious biases as well. Looking at ways to look at diversity and inclusion is important. We've just started talking at CAFE to a volunteer kind of consultant who has helped us understand where we can move forward specifically in that area. So if you don't have an intentional way of thinking about unconscious biases and diversity and inclusion, you will run into problems, no matter how much you put diversity and inclusion on your list of values or on your constitution, et cetera, et cetera. Mismatching, making sure the right person is assigned to the right role. And that, again, is a lot of trial and error and trying to understand, okay, well, maybe we should move someone from this role to that role. We can ask them, how do they feel in that role? You want to make sure the person is empowered. You want to make sure the person feels happy in the role that they're in. Communication, being open I like to think of clear and kind communication is really important. Sometimes being very, very unclear with your feedback is sometimes unkind because people don't know what they can do to improve. And then sometimes people say, oh, I'm really excited about, I love being blunt. So just be careful that blunt and brutal are sometimes some things you need to watch out for too, because if you're brutal, then sometimes that affects your effectiveness of your feedback as well. And then the last one I would mention that I have always been the most scared of as well is founder syndrome. So let's say you build something and then you build a committee or you build a new group, and that group becomes very central to your identity. And you then, like any new idea that comes from that group starts coming from yourself. Any direction starts coming from yourself. And then the organization is seen like it's, really that one person. And I've seen that particular issue affect a lot of organizations, not specifically that I've worked with, but peripherally I've seen that. And I'm, as someone who would call myself a builder, I'm particularly the most worried about this one for myself. So I have to make sure always that I'm looking at, from the get-go, how can I establish my own identity as being separate from the work that I do or the volunteer work that I do, so that if 3 years down the line, I feel that, my term is done and now I want to give this to someone who can bring this institution up to like level 2.0, for example, I can, it will work well for me and it will work well for the institution too. So the best way to deal with founder syndrome is to have those honest reflections as to, how will I feel if this particular organization or this particular group is co-led or led by a different individual, a year from now or 2 years from now or 3 years from now, and how can I help that new individual succeed and also make sure that I'm not taking over that particular new individual too. So coaching can help with that. Talking to people who have been in volunteer roles, coaching can help with all of this. So by coaching, I don't mean necessarily an official, role of coach, but bringing in people, asking people thoughts of who've been in this situation before as to how do you deal with these issues, whether it's fiscal instability, whether it's diversity, whether it's mismatch, whether it's founder syndrome. How do you manage this in your own capacity, and what can you think about for the future? And self-care, just want to mention, very, very important through all of this, because when you're building, you're going to come up with a lot of disappointment. And it's very, very important to have your cornerstones of self-care there. I don't see self-care as a luxury. I see it as a necessity. So whether that is, looking after mental health, whether that is, your usual exercise, diet, and then thinking about, protecting that space with regards to relationships as well. Planning your exit strategies. So I think about, from when I'm starting something, I am also thinking about exit strategies as well. I'm thinking about new people who I brought in on like an entry level basis. Could that person eventually be a co-president or a co-chair, or could they take my role after a certain period of time? You want to make sure the institution lives longer than you, and you want to always identify a few people who, if life happens, would also be able to replace the work that you're doing, and that requires humility as well. If you want to build your portfolio such that they're sustainable, so you want to make sure that if they're volunteer run, then each portfolio is not doing more than a certain number of hours per week, because otherwise you get susceptible to burnout, and then that becomes a weakness, and then you kind of, the institution gets affected that way too. And then identifying individuals from entry-level positions who could potentially have long-term potential with regards to other positions is very, very important. Think of people as look at people's potential. Think about what are they interested in, what area do they want to grow in, and how can we kind of invest in that person's growth so that it helps them as individuals. We want to care about people as individuals, and then it also will affect the institution as well in the long run. So that is it. Yeah, I didn't have a final question slide, so I'm just going to leave on this slide, and actually perhaps this slide kind of identifies all of the different things that you need to think about.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Shellyza. I feel incredibly grateful to have just literally learned so much. I think so much of your presentation also had threads in, you know, entrepreneurship, mentorship, and really building like long-term connections. So many reflections. So I think I'm going to turn it over to Jairus to provide a few reflections from his end on your presentation, and then we'll open it up to audience Q&A for the remainder of our time today. Jairus, I'd like to just quickly introduce you. So Dr. Jairus Swidrovich is an assistant professor in the teaching stream here at the Leslie Dan Faculty of Pharmacy at the University of Toronto. He is a queer, Two-Spirit, Saulteaux, and Ukrainian pharmacist from the Yellow Quill First Nation. Dr. Swidrovich recently founded and is the chair of the Indigenous Pharmacy Professionals of Canada. Jairus, I'll pass it over to you for some of your thoughts.
Sure. Thank you, Annalise, and thank you, Shellyza. That was really awesome. I've known Shellyza for a while, and we've had multiple discussions just in general, but then also in our capacities as CAFE and IPPC, which is the Indigenous Pharmacy Professionals of Canada. So I led a similar journey with the Indigenous Pharmacy Professionals of Canada, and what you were talking about, Shellyza, with founder syndrome, I actually hadn't heard of that before, but it resonates. And even some folks on our board of IPPC, one of them said in our retreat, they were like, when I think of IPPC, I think of Jairus. And I was like, like, no, that's not what it's supposed to be. You know, it's like for all of us, it's of Canada, it's not Jairus. So that was a moment of awakening of, okay, like I just need to just step away as much as possible now that that's created and there, let the community take that over. So almost all of my like speaking requests and whatnot that come through now, I pass off to the rest of the board and other members first, and then if they can't do it, then I'll take it on. So that's just one way that I try to avoid founder syndrome and also increase, like, uplift other folks and hear from other people. I think that when folks are looking for like an Indigenous perspective on something, it's often assumed that one person will satisfy that requirement, right? And usually I flip that situation around and say, like, tell me what pharmacists want for Christmas this year. And people would be like, it doesn't make sense. And I would be like, yeah, like you can't speak for everyone, right? Like same thing here. I don't know what every Indigenous person wants, what they believe, etc. We do generally have commonalities, and that's lovely. What I was also thinking about with this content too was, you know, Indigenous perspectives of climate change and the land and the importance of the land. And for the folks on the call, like Shellyza has approached the Indigenous Pharmacy Professionals of Canada as well. And we've had a few discussions about how to collaborate, but we generally as Indigenous folks believe that everything is connected to land. And a way that I like to emphasize that with folks is, if you were the first and only human today, just poof, you appeared on Earth and there were no other humans, how would you learn? Like, how would you live and survive and thrive? There's no textbooks, there's no videos, there's no other people to ask questions to. You would look at what's around you, right? You learn from the land and the animals about what's going on here and how do I survive? How did they survive? What did that bear do all winter? You know, how does that otter go in the water and on the land? Or how come the fish aren't in this part of the stream during these months, but they are the other months? And so then you learn and change your life based on land and animals, which is why we have clan systems in many of our cultures, and I belong to the otter clan as well as the bear clan. We also talk about how anything that we take from the land, we have to give back. So reciprocity, and I saw some of that in your presentation too. There's not like a there is a finite, resource here. Like the earth doesn't have a core that just lasts forever, and like we're only so big and there's only so much here. And our teachings generally say that we've been given everything that we need to survive forever, but that was kind of based on the way that we were stewards of the land and not in the way that things have come to today, particularly post colonization. So yeah, I encourage folks to think about that as well, like the actual content piece here and the importance of the land and how people have survived and thrived off of it for centuries. And even in the pharmacy context, our medicines first started from plants and animals. And much of the prescription medications we use today come from those initial uses as well. But just bringing it back to, setting up your own organization, it's a big challenge, especially when you want it to be something that's like a democracy, right? And so I didn't want to just say like, here's this organization, I'm the leader, who wants to be part of it. I had to just send out feelers across the country for a period of months, like who would like to do something in this area, and didn't have a name, didn't have a mandate, didn't have a vision, mission, values, just like, hey, I think there should be an entity with this focus area. And then brought people on board. We just were all volunteers, of course, talked about what needs to happen over time, met over a number of months, and then finally landed on what we thought would be a great name, filed our articles of incorporation and became an official entity. Lots of that I had to figure out myself, like sitting in a coffee shop during my conference travels. Even I had to pay the $12 because our bank account was overdrafted $12. So I used my personal money. So it's kind of interesting getting something started in that way, but once it's there, and especially once you're able to access funding, you talked about sustainability of your organization, how everyone starts as a volunteer. That's really, really key too. So thankfully we were lucky to come upon a significant chunk of money and pay an executive director. So we have like one staff member who does the work every day as their full-time job, and then the board has now become like an advisory rather than the doers, whereas in the initial phases the board is also the doers, right? Like the organization also kind of becomes the staff or volunteer staff, and that's not sustainable either. So we're in a good place right now, but sustainability is a big concern moving forward too. So all of what you mentioned in that regard really resonates with me as well.
Thanks so much, Sheriff. Really appreciate your reflections, just from some of your own areas of work. And again, thrilled that you two have met prior to this session and have some collaborations going there. If there's any questions from the audience, we are a small group today, so I'll invite people to either maybe raise their hand using the Zoom function or to type their questions into the chat box. I'll maybe give people a second to do that. While I do, I have a question of my own. Shellyza and Jareth as well. I was curious, Shellyza, in your presentation and just knowing a little bit about CAFE, if you could speak a little bit to sort of the development of having co-leads for specific areas, externally and internally within the organization, sort of how that came to be and what the strengths and power of that have been, because it strikes me, you mentioned it sort of in the consultancy piece of your slide, but having that regular check-in with someone else to help keep you accountable and kind of keep the momentum going in different ways really struck me as a great avenue. So yeah, please.
Yeah, so there's like, I feel like there's not a one size fits all for these types of things, but we had thought about co-leads because we had felt that it was very, very easy to get overwhelmed in the space. And to also feel like a sense of imposter syndrome in the space too, because, it's a new space, right? Those of us who have been working in this space have not been working for many, many, many years. So, and we had thought that, that conversation, that connection that could be provided with the two co-leads would help. And we also felt that, we had just come out of COVID. And we had also felt that, sometimes for volunteers particularly, there can be pressures on the ground that can or personal circumstances. Like when I was the co-president of Pharmacists Without Borders, that's when my diagnosis came, right? So there's all these different factors that can potentially happen. There are weaknesses, however, which are things that we have also explored as well. So you want to make sure if you do choose a co-lead, you know, you need to make sure that the two individuals are people who would work well together. I mean, that kind of makes a lot of sense, but you have to think of that with foresight. Like, are these two people individuals who could kind of balance each other out? Are they individuals who would at least theoretically work well together? It's a good idea to also have some kind of initial guidance as to, you know, this is an example of how you guys could split things up, but you don't need to follow that example, but you know, this is just an example. And the reason is because you want to have good structures as to who is responsible for what, because then otherwise things can get confusing too. So you don't need to go with a co-lead approach. I think I'm a little biased because I think I mentioned this before, but I like to find out where my blind spots are. So I find the co-lead approach useful to be able, because the other person tends to be the person for me who is very good at knowing where my blind spots are and very good at balancing that out. If I don't have a co-chair approach, then if I have a chair and vice chair kind of approach instead, then I like to have a very kind of more horizontal, you know, bi-directional flow of ideas in order to really help that move forward. But you don't need to go with a co-lead approach. It's just kind of an example that we thought would work well for CAPI specifically.
Yeah, no, thanks, Shellyza. I was just curious. It isn't an approach I've typically seen, I guess, within some of my own work, but and I know there's, you know, two sides to everything, but was just curious to learn a bit more. Jairus, is there anything that stood out from that or anything you'd like to comment on?
The only thing I'll add there is, like, I maybe have my own preferences. Well, I do, but creating our own organization, I just put it back in the hands of everyone and said, like, how do you want this to be structured, right? And I just listed off a whole bunch of possibilities, and people loved at the time the idea of co-leads or co-chairs. And then over time, once we landed on money and were able to pay someone, the other co-chair, Amy Lamb, she was like, well, hey, I would love for this to be my job. So she moved from co-chair to the executive director. And then we took that question back to the whole group. Well, who wants to be co-chair? And then they said, well, actually, maybe let's go with like chair, vice chair type of situation. So it changed, and it can change. You can change those things at any time. And so that's where we're at now. But we also had the challenge and opportunity to mimic Indigenous governance styles, too, of not wanting to have like a hierarchy, but after being counseled by other folks and whatnot, we went with this structure anyway, because it's makes sense to people from the outside, versus if we all just had a title and were part of a circle, people wouldn't know who to go to, or they wouldn't understand your role. But yeah, we started with co-lead, and now we have chair, vice chair.
Yeah, I want to just quickly mention that, like, you know, you have a lot of different abilities to check in with your team to see what's working. So you can a really good thing that I didn't mention in the presentation is to organize check-ins, so that you can develop that relationship, so that your group members actually feel comfortable telling you what they think, because you want things to be horizontal, and you want to facilitate the best way for that knowledge exchange, that idea exchange to happen. So how do you do that? Like, there's trust that comes there. There's individual, you know, the ability to reach out to different groups. There's that open conversation that happens in a group arena. And I think there's that. And then you could also choose to go the strategic planning route as well for your kind of, if you once you get there, to bring in key stakeholders who can also have that kind of knowledge exchange as well, which will really give you the best product. I think that what Jairus mentioned with regards to facilitating and creating those areas of group dialogue and having that, facilitating that has to be very intentional.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I'm curious, just quickly, we're almost at time, but just if either of you sort of have any final reflections on how that sort of relates to creating an open environment, particularly perhaps when you are the founder and maybe you're trying to separate yourself from that founder syndrome piece, but then you're also trying to elevate others to make sure that their voices are actually being heard at the table. Probably a great question to end on. So
Sure. So this is very interesting. So what I've had to do, I think I'm a little bit biased because for me, I'm very open I've presented about cancer survivorship and then going back to working with cancer patients after going through cancer myself. So, but for this specifically, I would say that for me, going through treatment made me realize that I am not it really hit my head properly that I am not my work. And my value systems are very connected to who I am. My value systems are very connected to who I am. But what happens and what gets channeled through those value systems is work that is just connected to that. So so for me, Jairus will like this. I try grounded approaches with regards to mindfulness and meditation and having your feet grounded to the land. That for me really helps me because if I'm really stressed and it's been a very busy week, it's a good day-to-day, week-to-week reminder. And that kind of intentional reminder then affects, I feel your orientation towards certain things. But yeah, very curious to what Jairus will say on this.
I was actually just going to leave it with you to have those last beautiful words, if that's okay.
Thank you both so much. I hope I can speak on behalf of everyone online that I'm very touched by both of you sharing, personal stories, how that feeds into some of the incredible work that you're both doing. So thank you. Thank you for sharing your stories with us and with our audience. I'd like to say take care to everyone online, and we'll hope to see you again at a future CPE event.